Brooke Tanner was only 17 when her lifeless body was found at the bottom of the basement stairs. Her stepfather, Alan Mercer, the one who made the 911 call, claimed it was a tragic accident. But as investigators dug deeper, Brooke's final texts, Alan's crumbling alibi, and a haunting pattern from his past began to reveal a far darker truth. Was Alan the grieving parent he claimed to be, or had he been hiding a deadly secret all along? On the morning of October 18, 2016, emergency dispatchers in Cedar Falls, Iowa, received a calm but shaken voice on the other end of a 911 call. It was Alan Mercer, a local contractor, reporting that his teenage stepdaughter, Brooke Tanner, had fallen down the basement stairs. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but it was already too late. Brooke was lying motionless at the foot of the steps, her head turned at an unnatural angle, eyes open, and skin pale. Alan stood nearby, hands trembling but dry, repeating that he had just come home and found her like that. Brooke's mother, Diana, was contacted at work and arrived shortly after, collapsing to her knees in shock as she saw her daughter's lifeless body being carried out under a sheet. The initial theory was a tragic household accident. The carpet on the basement steps was old and slightly loose, and the rain from earlier that morning had made everything damp. There were no obvious signs of struggle, no weapons, and no immediate evidence of forced entry. Police documented the scene, took basic statements, and handed the case over to the coroner's office. Alan explained that he had left around 8 a.m. to pick up supplies from the hardware store and returned a few hours later. He said Brooke was supposed to be sleeping in after a late night studying for exams. His story was straightforward and unemotional, delivered with the kind of certainty that made it hard to question. At first, the medical examiner began a routine autopsy and noted some concerning details. Brooke had suffered blunt force trauma to the back of her skull, consistent with a fall, but there was also an older, healing bruise on her shoulder blade. It wasn't enough to prove abuse, but it was enough to raise questions. Moreover, the angle of the injury suggested that she might not have simply tripped, she may have been pushed. The basement had no railing along one side, and the stairs ended in a cement floor. A fall could certainly be deadly, but the mechanics didn't align perfectly with the injury pattern. Back at the Tanner home, a few subtle details began to bother the officers assigned to the case. There was a shattered phone near Brooke's hand, and it looked like it had been thrown rather than dropped. The lights in the basement were still on, although Alan claimed no one had been down there that morning. A faint, partial boot print was visible on one of the steps, something they photographed but initially couldn't match. Neighbors were interviewed, and while no one had seen the fall, one neighbor remembered something odd. Around 10:30 a.m., they noticed Alan's truck in the driveway, even though he claimed he hadn't returned until closer to noon. It wasn't enough to contradict his story outright, but it planted the seed of doubt. What had first looked like a terrible accident was beginning to feel off. Quiet suspicions turned into whispered conversations, and the question nobody dared ask out loud was now creeping through everyone's mind. What really happened to Brooke Tanner that morning? Detectives turned their attention to Brooke's phone, which had been collected from the basement floor, its screen cracked and unresponsive. Forensic analysts managed to recover data from the device, and what they found began to shift the narrative in a dramatic way. Brooke had been texting until after midnight the night before her death. Her final conversations were with her best friend, Rachel, and they were anything but casual. In those texts, Brooke opened up about her growing fear of Alan. She described constant arguments, subtle threats, and a feeling of being watched. She wrote that she didn't trust him and suspected he was going through her things when she wasn't home. In one of her last messages, she typed, "If something ever happens to me, tell the police to look at Alan." That message alone changed everything. What had been treated as an accident was now a potential crime scene. Investigators contacted Rachel, who confirmed that Brooke had seemed increasingly anxious in recent months. She had even talked about wanting to run away after graduation. When asked if Brooke ever mentioned physical violence, Rachel hesitated. Then she said yes, once, about a year ago. Brooke claimed Alan shoved her during an argument. She never told her mom, afraid it would cause too much chaos. Rachel assumed it was a one-time thing. Now, it seemed like part of a larger pattern. Police also discovered several deleted search entries on Brooke's phone. She had looked up phrases like how to report abuse without parents knowing, and what happens when a minor files a complaint. These weren't the kinds of things someone casually searched. They pointed to a girl who felt unsafe and unsure of where to turn. The more detectives examined, the more they realized Brooke had been silently crying out for help in digital spaces. Even if she didn't speak up in the real world. Meanwhile, forensic specialists reviewed the staircase again. That partial boot print stood out. It was faint, but visible enough to compare. Alan's work boots were collected and matched the tread pattern exactly. It was impossible to say when the print had been made, but it added to the growing weight of suspicion. Investigators also noted a smudge on the wall halfway down the stairs, possibly from someone grabbing at the drywall while falling. They ordered further tests to see if it contained skin cells or fibers that might help reconstruct Brooke's final moments. Diana Tanner, Brooke's mother, remained in a state of disbelief. She refused to believe Alan could have harmed her daughter. To her, he had always been kind, responsible, and supportive, especially after the loss of Brooke's biological father. But when detectives gently shared the contents of Brooke's messages, Diana's reaction shifted. She began to ask questions she hadn't dared consider. Why did Alan never mention the argument he had with Brooke the night before? Why had Brooke told her friend she was afraid to be alone with him? As doubt crept into Diana's mind, the case took a decisive turn. What had begun as an unfortunate fall was now unraveling into a far more sinister possibility. Brooke hadn't simply fallen, she may have been silenced. The deeper investigators dug into Alan Mercer's past, the more troubling patterns began to emerge. On the surface, Alan had always appeared to be a model citizen. He ran a successful contracting business, attended community events, and was known for helping neighbors with yard work or minor home repairs. To most who knew him, he was polite, reliable, and calm under pressure. But behind that carefully managed image was a man with a history that had never fully come to light until now. Records revealed that before moving to Iowa, Alan had lived in a small town in Ohio with a former girlfriend named Melissa. In 2008, Melissa's 2-year-old son died under suspicious circumstances while in Alan's care. The official cause of death was listed as accidental drowning, and Alan claimed the child slipped and fell into a filled bathtub while he was taking a phone call in the other room. There were no witnesses, and with no solid evidence of foul play, the case was closed without charges. But the local police report, now resurfaced, noted inconsistencies in Alan's story and a bruise on the child's neck that was never fully explained. At the time, Melissa was devastated but not strong enough to fight the ruling. She moved away shortly after, and the incident faded from public memory. Alan, meanwhile, left Ohio and relocated to Cedar Falls, where he eventually met Diana. He never mentioned the child's death. Diana had no idea. When police interviewed Melissa in light of Brooke's case, she broke down. She said she always suspected something was wrong but felt powerless to prove it. Her story, combined with Brooke's final texts and the strange circumstances of both deaths, painted a disturbing picture. Meanwhile, detectives reviewed Alan's financials, phone records, and timeline on the morning of Brooke's death. They discovered that Alan's claim of being at the hardware store was completely untrue. Receipts showed no purchases, and surveillance from the store confirmed he never arrived. His phone pinged on a tower near his home during the time he claimed to be away. The lie was small, but significant. Why falsify a timeline if there was nothing to hide? Neighbors began to come forward with their own observations. One woman recalled hearing shouting from the Tanner home late the night before Brooke was found. Another mentioned that Brooke often walked around the block late in the evening, alone, headphones in, seemingly trying to escape the house. A teacher at Brooke's school told police that Brooke had asked vague questions about legal emancipation a few months earlier, though she never explained why. With each revelation, the image of Alan Mercer began to crack. What once looked like a tragic coincidence, one young girl dead in a fall, was now linked to a pattern of young victims under his care suffering unexplained injuries or death. The timing, the lies, the past, none of it could be ignored. Investigators began to believe that Brooke hadn't just been a victim of circumstance. She might have been a target. The investigation gained momentum when detectives uncovered a crucial piece of surveillance footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera. The timestamp showed Alan's truck parked in the driveway at 10:37 a.m., nearly an hour and a half earlier than he claimed. This directly contradicted his statement that he arrived home around noon to find Brooke at the bottom of the basement stairs. Investigators cross-referenced the footage with Alan's phone data, which placed him within the vicinity of his home during the same time frame. The carefully constructed timeline he provided was collapsing. When questioned again, Alan remained calm, insisting he must have remembered the time wrong. But the footage left little room for doubt. He had lied. Combined with his false claim about the hardware store visit, detectives now had concrete proof that Alan had tried to mislead the investigation. The big question was why. Forensic analysts returned to the scene for a second, more detailed sweep. That partial boot print on the staircase, photographed but not previously identified, was now compared against Alan's work boots. The match was undeniable. The tread pattern, scuff marks, and size aligned exactly. Though it didn't prove how or when the print was made, it placed him on the stairs close to the time of Brooke's death, at a spot where he claimed he hadn't been. Then came another breakthrough. Crime scene technicians found a small fragment of Brooke's fingernail lodged in the drywall halfway down the basement stairs. Under a microscope, they discovered a sliver of skin beneath it. DNA tests confirmed the skin belonged to Alan. This suggested a struggle. Brooke may have reached out and scratched him as she fell, or possibly during an altercation. It was the most direct physical evidence yet connecting Alan to Brooke's final moments. The case took on even more weight when detectives located a hidden file folder on Alan's computer. It was encrypted but eventually unlocked by digital forensics. Inside were screenshots of Brooke's private social media posts and personal files. It appeared Alan had been monitoring her online activity without her knowledge. He had read her private messages, including the ones where she expressed fear of him. It became clear he knew Brooke was thinking about telling someone, and he had been tracking her to keep it under control. When detectives confronted Alan with this evidence, he didn't break. He repeated his earlier story and claimed Brooke was a troubled teen looking for attention. But behind closed doors, even his attorney started to grow uneasy. The mounting inconsistencies, the hidden surveillance, and the physical evidence told a story Alan couldn't talk his way out of. Back at home, Diana was unraveling. The more she learned, the more she realized how much she had overlooked. The man she married, the man she believed had brought stability to her life, was now the center of a nightmare she never imagined. In the quiet of her living room, staring at Brooke's school photo on the mantel, she began to ask the same question that had now consumed the entire investigation. If Alan wasn't guilty, why did he lie about everything? The trial of Alan Mercer began in the spring of 2018, nearly a year and a half after Brooke Tanner's death. The courtroom was packed every day, with reporters, neighbors, and classmates of Brooke all eager to hear what had really happened behind the doors of the Tanner home. Alan sat quietly at the defense table, dressed in a tailored gray suit, expression unreadable. The man once seen as a devoted stepfather was now accused of murder, and the evidence against him was damning. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. They presented Brooke's text messages, which captured her growing fear of Alan and her desperate attempts to reach out. They showed the surveillance footage proving Alan lied about his whereabouts, the phone records that contradicted his alibi, and the boot print that matched his shoes. Then came the most damaging piece of evidence, the DNA recovered from Brooke's fingernail embedded in the wall, suggesting a struggle had occurred as she fell, or was pushed, down the stairs. They also introduced testimony from Alan's former girlfriend in Ohio, who described her 2-year-old son's unexplained drowning while in Alan's care. Though never convicted, the similarities were enough to paint a disturbing pattern. The jury listened as she recalled the doubts that haunted her for years, doubts she now believed were justified. The defense tried to dismantle the case by focusing on the lack of eyewitnesses and proposing alternate theories. They claimed Brooke had a history of anxiety and could have lost her balance due to lack of sleep or emotional stress. They argued that Alan's inconsistencies were due to confusion in a moment of shock, not evidence of guilt. They even suggested that the DNA on the wall could have transferred there at a different time. But each argument felt thinner than the last. Brooke's mother, Diana, took the stand with trembling hands. Her voice cracked as she described the changes she saw in Brooke in the months before her death: withdrawal, irritability, and subtle signs she now realized were cries for help. She admitted that she once saw Brooke and Alan arguing but dismissed it as typical teenage rebellion. That memory now filled her with guilt. When asked if she believed Alan was capable of hurting Brooke, she looked directly at him before softly saying yes. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. Alan showed no emotion as the sentence was read. He was given 30 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Diana sobbed quietly in the front row. Outside the courthouse, supporters held candles in Brooke's memory, many still grappling with the horrifying truth that had come to light. Even with the conviction, some questions remained unanswered. There were no security cameras in the basement, no direct eyewitness to the fall, and no confession from Alan. But the trail of lies, the digital footprints, and the subtle patterns of control all pointed to one chilling conclusion: Brooke Tanner didn't just fall. She was failed, ignored, and ultimately betrayed by the man who was supposed to protect her.